Hello. Can you guys hear me? Well, thank you all for coming this evening. And I would really like to thank Stan and Rosemary for coming this entire week and being with us. For those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to meet Stan, he's kind of a hard person to introduce. And he's a hard person to introduce because he's done so much. I could talk about him being a fiction writer. I could talk about the great nonfiction works that he's written. I could talk about him being an organic farmer, about his travels, about his relationship with Rosemary, about all sorts of different things, probably other things that I don't even know about yet. And so instead of kind of introducing him by way of that, I'll just tell you how I was introduced to him myself and what he meant to me at the time and what his work has meant to me since then and what our friendship has meant to me now too. I was a junior in college when I went to, or after junior year in college, the summer after, I went to northern New Mexico to do research for my senior thesis. And I was in the archive every day and reading about the area, and I had read all of these academic studies. And I still didn't feel like I had any sense of what the region was like, what knitted this place together. And I was at a used bookstore, and I saw Stan's Mayordomo, a book about his experiences with the community irrigation ditch in his neighborhood and on his own farm. And in reading that, which I did in that evening after I purchased it, I started to understand a little bit more about the communities that I was reading about. And I started to kind of comprehend the things that I was reading in the archive and how it fit in. And I started to be able to look around while I traveled through northern New Mexico and start to see with new eyes because of that book. And so that book meant so much to me at that time, and certainly his other books have as well. And then I had the great fortune of going down there with some of the students who are in the audience today, going to northern New Mexico and going to Stan and Rosemary's farm, and having the opportunity to spend the day with them. And that is a whole new experience that hopefully some of you will have at some point in time. But that was by way of introduction, and Stan Crawford for you guys.
Thank you, Jeff. And I can't see very well out there, but I assume I know about half the audience from the 5 or 6 classes and discussions that Rosemary and I have participated in the last few days. This has been a very warm experience here, and I would like to thank Jeff certainly and Henrietta and staff of the Murphy Foundation where we're staying. I've also thought that since perhaps most of you have heard me speak over the last couple of days, you have little parcels of my talk. So ideally, you could all get together, this would be like what happens on the internet, and piece it all back together. And I wouldn't have to give the talk, but it might take several days. So actually, I'm going to save you time by giving this talk. The title baffled me for a long time because I couldn't remember where it came from, and it turns out that Jeff created the title. And it's kind of a steeplechase title. I hope I don't slip and fall between the beginning and the end. Satirizing crime and defending place. But it was actually very useful in terms of organizing some very disparate ideas. One of the reasons I'm here tonight is that when I was young, I wrote a sort of a detective story. I was in my 20s, but I wrote it on the island of Lesbos. And it's called Gascoigne, and it's about an old man who spends his life managing his slumlord empire from his car using a radio telephone. This was written in 63, 64. Radio telephones did exist. This one, of course, operates flawlessly, unlike even our cell phones today. And that came out of my job, my first and only one of 2 full-time jobs I've held in my life, office jobs. I worked for a year and a half as a technical writer in LA, and I had so little to do that I read and discovered detective fiction, starting with the James Bond thrillers, which were all the rage then. Rather badly written, but a lot of fun. And what I was amazed by was the the narrative energy of these things, which I had not experienced in 6 years of English department education. So my first attempts at novels were satirical parodies, as it were, and Gascoigne was the third, which I wrote in the village of Molivos on Lesbos, first time in my adult life. I was a Californian kid. First time in my adult life that I didn't have a car or phone. Now, that was Circumstance A. That was a crime novel, I suppose. So that's kind of why I'm here. The other is B. The reason I went to Europe to write was that I could earn enough money in a year and a half in LA and San Bernardino, working for the missile industry, doing what I later thought was the devil's work, to save up enough money to go to Greece, which was very cheap at the time. Now, I was able in Gascoigne, the novel, to satirize what I had experienced as a technical writer and as a projectionist for a number of conferences attended by CIA and ASA people. I satirized that in an episode in Gascoigne about the Defensive Zoological Warfare Systems Labs. So that's about as far as I can go in terms of my expertise in the topic of the Murphy, is it year, I think, crime. Now, my most recent published novel centers around another aging tycoon. If he's somewhat more respectable than Gascoigne, he also is a lover of cars and is a fanatical consumer of fossil fuels, more of which later. None of what the protagonist of Petroleum Man, the novel I'll read from in a while, nothing that he does, which is to fly constantly around the world in his private Boeing, to manage his business empire, or driving expensive gas-guzzling exotic cars. None of that was illegal when I wrote it in 2004, and last time I checked, it still is not illegal. But let's flash forward to the year 2030 or 2050, when the world presumably has become more racked by the severe climatic events triggered by global warming. Forward to that interesting environmental deadline when it will be illegal to drive a vehicle powered by fossil fuel, illegal to run a fossil fuel-powered furnace or heater, and so on. Improbable, unlikely. At this point, we can't really know. But within my lifetime, it was once common and even legal to dump all kinds of toxic substances into rivers and lakes and the ocean and pump them into the air. Now, of course, within the past generation, many of these practices, not unfortunately all, have been sanctioned and even criminalized. In many cities, you can't burn a fireplace on certain days without risking a fine. And of course, we have the government mandated fuel efficiency standards, which are gradually increasing and perhaps leading to what I'm suggesting. But this leads to, I think, a more general and interesting question of how we have defined criminality throughout civilization, and particularly within the past several hundred years, and how society is constantly revising what it considers criminal. Think, for example, of slavery and apartheid and discrimination in all its forms, and how they've been banned in most societies. Not all, of course. Think of what one might call unregulated immigration. My Canadian and German grandparents probably filled out no papers when they came to this country. Rosemary, who's Australian, had to fill out, well, we had to fill out a lot, because when we applied in Greece to get our green card, we had to have every document translated into Greek, including documents in English, which were sent to the embassy and presumably translated back into English. We moved to Ireland, and we didn't have to do that in Gaelic. In the other direction, think of drug use, which is wide open and unregulated until the early years of this century, until 20th century, until Prohibition. And Prohibition, in a sense, has evolved into the war on drugs of today. The opposite direction, the liberalizing attitudes towards sex and same-sex relationships, again, within Western societies. Some of our great 18th and 19th century novels are about adultery. The Scarlet Letter, Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina. Adultery, of course, was not entirely a crime, but the commission of it had legal effects on women who were more or less considered property. That changed when women and, of course, slaves were no longer regarded as property and treated as human, so that crimes against them were indeed crimes. A work which explores the ever-shifting line between what is acceptable and moral and legal and what is not is the extraordinary TV series The Wire. Rosemary and I have been rewatching it second time recently. The series is grounded on the experience of its co-creators. Ed Burns served as a Baltimore policeman for 20 years and then took up the more difficult task of teaching in a middle school. David Simon worked for the Baltimore Sun for a number of years. To touch where I began, The Wire upsets or undermines, though not satirically, many of the detective story cliches that we've come used to. It's one of the several ways that it established itself as much more than just a cops and druggies story of crime and retribution. It undermines these cliches, as I say, not satirically, but through methods of what one might call high realism. An example, which I love, is the lead detective, who's played by Dominic West, the lead white detective, trails one of the drug kingpins played by Hendrix, who's black, and they're in their two cars, and of course you expect this is going to end up as a chase or a confrontation or a shootout. Well, it ends up in the hallways of a Baltimore community college where the Stringer Bell character, the drug lord character, is taking a course on macroeconomics. There are a couple others, there are many others like this. But the point here is that the Stringer Bell character is seeking ways, in part, to become legal. He's invested a lot of his drug money in legal businesses. On the other side, there's, I think this is the second episode, which I find the most moving, a union boss, longshoreman's union boss, and his son and family, in the interest of trying to improve the Port of Baltimore by dredging it and restoring a grain elevator, get involved in contraband and drug dealing with tragic consequences. But their intentions, of course, are wonderful. As I say, the series is shot through with wonderful contradictions. There's one of the important drug guys has an amazing collection of tropical fish. There's another, a young kid becomes very depressed at the violence within the drug culture. There's a politician, a guy running for mayor, who actually learned something in the course of campaigning for mayor. No good deed goes unpunished, and no evildoer is 100% evil. And politics, whether in the police department or in the drug world, trump everything else. One of the more interesting and intriguing episodes is in order to try to get the crime statistics down in a certain neighborhood, a police major, Howard Bunny Colvin, his fictional name, decides to legalize drugs in a city block area, which comes to be called Amsterdam. So no arrests will be made in Amsterdam. It's a little square of row houses, Baltimore row houses. No arrests will be made as long as there's no violence. The numbers for crime violence drop dramatically. It's a success. Now, this was actually based on a remark that a mayor of Baltimore, a real mayor of Baltimore in the 1980s made, Howard Kurt Schmoke. He suggested that drugs should be decriminalized and turned into a health problem, as it were. It basically messed up his career, that remark. But he came back to play a cameo role as a health department official in The Wire. Actually, I think he went on. His professional life was not totally destroyed, just somewhat delayed. One of the interesting things about The Wire, a lot of this you don't see the first time, is that the cops and the lawyers and the judges all drink wildly. I don't think this series would be popular in Conway, but the legal people all drink wildly. There are lots of wild bar scenes. The drug dealers don't use their stuff. They're clean, they're sober. Interesting contrast. Clean dealers and drunken cops. I think the writers are making a point that both licit and illicit drugs exact their toll in human terms. Now, of course, in the real world, it's now legal in quite a few states to purchase, grow, sell marijuana for medical purposes. And a number of drugs have been decriminalized in the Netherlands, England, and Portugal with mixed results. This is not a simple problem by any means. And Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, has declared the war on drugs to be a failure. And in some states, we're spending more on prisons, swollen by huge populations of drug users and dealers. We're spending more on prisons than we are in higher education. I would suggest that about the time we begin banning the use of fossil fuels, except for a number of specialized manufacturing operations, we will have decriminalized all drug use, and we'll have come to see it as a health problem, much as we now treat smoking and alcohol. And of course, alcohol claims more people than drugs. So, back to fossil fuels, our biggest drug problem of all. In reading Bill McKibben's latest book, Earth, spelled with 2 A's, because he's talking about a planet that's different from the one that we used to have, I was struck by a number he threw out. A 55-gallon barrel of oil provides the energy equivalent of 10 years of human physical labor as translated into the caloric equivalent required for a human being to work. I was particularly struck because I spent a good part of the year as a small farmer doing physical labor. I know what it feels like. I know what it gets done. I know the toll it exacts on body and mind. But I also know that physical labor is or generates a kind of knowledge about place that may be impossible to acquire in any other way. Standing on a piece of ground or even wandering around on it, you can learn something, perhaps even a great deal, but not as much, I suggest, as you can by digging, hoeing, weeding, planting, irrigating, harvesting, and indeed eating from that land. During that time, you were there under the sky, in the weather, in the middle of seasonal migratory currents, springtime and summertime breeding periods. And you're working along with armies of plants and insects, spiders, and the complex, largely invisible world, incredibly complex, invisible world of soil, molds, bacteria, fungi, and innumerable forms of microscopic life, many of which have never been fully studied. As a gardener or farmer, or at least as a farmer is not totally mechanized, isolated within an air-conditioned cab and a GPS and TV and whatever, guided by lasers, as not that kind of farmer. You become part of the environment, part of the ecosystem. Of course, we always are, no matter what, even here. Though, for the most part, our relation to the environment is a source of degradation. When we drive, fly, turn on the lights, we are adding to that degradation, as we all know. But as someone working the soil, in even a minimal way, you become, or can become, a conscious part of the ecosystem. And as such, an expert of sorts in a small piece of land, a garden plot even, by which you also sustain yourself. And as such, potentially a formidable defender of what you have come to know and love. Fossil fuels, in particular cheap fossil fuels, and in particular inequitably distributed cheap fossil fuels, are the enemy of place. As an aside, Paul Hawken, who wrote a couple of wonderful books, Natural Capitalism, lost the other one. Paul Hawken once estimated that were the energy resources of the planet equitably distributed, we would all be allowed one transatlantic flight in our lifetimes. We're also used to unfettered mobility, that the thought of being confined in one place, as many Chinese peasants still legally are, well, it's pretty unthinkable. Indeed, mobility is still considered a good, a perk of the successful business or professional life. We go, therefore we are. But we suffer the usual contradictions. Many of us live in interchangeable places with very little character, and we go to vacation in places that have been created by the accretions of labor of hundreds of years or thousands of years, or places unspoiled by highway or runway. Now, I'm certainly sensitive to the counter arguments. For the past 40 years, Rosemary and I have lived in a village of 1,500 in northern New Mexico, between Taos and Santa Fe. A village which has done its share of stifling, discouraging, and crippling those who didn't fit in, those who couldn't adapt easily to the cultural and linguistic changes over the past several hundred years. A village that has exported generation after generation of young people, and which continues to do so. Nor am I blind to the cultural, social, economic, and even ecological benefits of large cities, where we love to go on vacation. Bill McKibben is, I'm sure, quite entirely aware of all this and much more, and he suggests that the collective big city for all of us at a time of restricted mobility in the future will be the internet. But of course, the internet is not without its own huge and growing carbon footprint. My most recent novel, Petroleum Man, a satire of sorts, started out as a more serious nonfiction project about cars, about industrial processes, and about mobility. I'm mostly what I suppose might be considered a responsible consumer, having driven fuel-efficient cars most of my life. But 10 years ago, no, this is 10 years ago, I calculated that I had driven by then about 1 million miles, had burned 40,000 gallons of gasoline and diesel, enough to fill 4 10,000-gallon tanker trucks, which is what you see on the highway. And it used another 300 or more gallons of oil for oil changes, had worn out nearly 150 tires. Ignoring the losses occasioned in the refining process and using Bill McKibben's assertion that a barrel of oil produces the energy equivalent of about 10 years of human physical labor, then the fuel used by my million miles of driving equals about 7,000 or 8,000 years of human labor. These calculations don't include the energy consumption of manufacturing the vehicles I used, nor in the huge amounts of petroleum employed in asphalt paving, something we often don't really think about, nor flying, taking trains, or the half-dozen transatlantic crossings by ship in the good old days. Nor do they include the petroleum used in so many throwaway consumer goods that my family and I use. A year or so of writing about this stuff, which included learning the staggering roadkill numbers, habitat disruptions on highways, and on, sent me over a kind of aesthetic edge. The summer of 2002, I think it was, I threw up my hands and began listening to a curmudgeonly voice that was urging me to tell his story. The political climate of the time, mild compared to today, was also a factor. I had to live with Leon Tugg's, arch capitalist, ruler of the universe, for almost 2 years. Not a pleasant experience. But he was very good at sending up my own liberal pieties, and for that I owe him a debt of gratitude, sort of. In any case, I would like to present some of his more radical opinions, which bear on some of what I've been talking about. The story of the novel is roughly this. Leon Tugg's wildly successful engineer by training, inventor of the ubiquitous thingy, something everyone uses all the time. I don't actually describe it in the novel because I don't know what it is, but a critic suggested that it was a cross between a Post-it and Microsoft Office. In any case, it has made him fabulously wealthy. And in his old age, he decides to give his 2 grandchildren extensive custom-made toy or miniature models of every car he's ever owned, one at a time in chronological order, an autobiography. Accompanying each of these gifts over the course of a decade or so are letters explaining the car's place in his rise to stellar financial success. Letters that he composes in his Boeing while he's flying around the world in the middle of the night when nobody will answer a phone anywhere. Needless to say, the 2 grandchildren don't really appreciate or understand these gifts, particularly as they get older. They don't appreciate them at all in their teenage years, nor really do his wife nor his daughter, mother of his grandchildren, nor his son-in-law, who is unfortunately a left-leaning attorney. Excuse me while I briefly assume the persona of Leon Tugg's, master of the universe. Now, his grandson Fabian has reached the age of learning how to drive, and of course his first car will be a Lamborghini. His grandfather is giving him some advice. You will be practicing, of course, not in order to become a mere driver of cars and other vehicles or a pilot of planes or even a captain of power boats, but for something far more important. You will be practicing to become a man, a special kind of man, far superior to all those that have come before, those throwers of spears and rocks, those wielders of clubs and swords and firearms, petty smashers and breakers, and uprooters, defacers, and demolitionists. No, none of these you will become. They may be passing phases, of course, on the path to that far greater role of a fully realized contemporary of the world in its present magnificent configuration. You will become a petroleum man, and this is what you must now begin practicing for. Although the concept of a petroleum man may at first seem frightening in terms of the awesome responsibilities implied in such a title, all you have to do is look up around you and you will see countless examples of exceedingly successful petroleum people, namely myself and your grandmother, though she doesn't know it, and your own mother and father, although he denies he's such a thing. What we petroleum people are good at is arranging our lives and the lives of others so as to use as much petroleum and derivative products and related natural resources as is humanly possible, in order to create and use up more and more things of ever-increasing complexity, and in order to replace the now nearly obsolete natural world with a model of vastly improved design. That is a world faster, more convenient, more comfortable, and far more entertaining than the rather shoddy model clapped together in 6 days. Petroleum was hidden away in the bowels of the earth so that when humanity reached that degree of evolution where we finally deserved to use it, it would be there. Evolution being, please note, nothing more than nature's far too sluggish version of planned obsolescence. And more of the same a bit. Now, it's all very well to go so what and ho-hum at this point and fail to notice the important action of geometric proliferation of the wheel throughout the world. In the way that it has smoothed, compacted, abraded, pounded down, firmed up, buffed, and polished the earth. And in general, how the wheel has been such a dynamic force in rendering so much of the surface of the earth ever smoother and therefore more friendly and hospitable to the wheel. It is the wheel that draws forth more asphalt, more cement, more gravel in ever greater quantities over ever-increasing surfaces of land. Pave me, the world cries out before the wheel. Pave me over. Let there be rivers of pavement, fields of pavement, lakes of pavement, seas of pavement, oceans and oceans of pavement. Let us dream of paving until the very end of time. The ever-restless wheel seeks out more opportunities as we rush to build machines that satisfy its craving to smooth the rough, flatten the corrugated, round off the edges of nature. The roller skate, the mountain bike, the skateboard, the ATV, the SUV, all clearing deserts of brush, forests of trees, jungles of whatever they are cleared of, plus the great wheels of jet airliners with their unquenchable thirst for entire square miles of thick, reinforced concrete. Where once it was the sword, the spear, the crossbow, the musket, the rifle, the cannon, smallpox, the mortar, the tank, the atom bomb, napalm, Agent Orange that subdued the earth. Now it is simply and elegantly the wheel, in the form of those countless tires upon which we ride each day, knowing each time we step into a car and sit down that we will experience a quiet moment of joy sent up our spine by the first instance of rolling. The wheel to which all shoulders are now applied, rich and poor, conservative Republican and liberal Democrat alike, the wheel which all labor for and worship, from the child going rrr as he pushes the small metal toy car back and forth on the carpet, to the elder five-star general of industry who with the push of a button can cause millions of wheels to start turning all over the world. And in the middle of a 70-mile-an-hour bumper-to-bumper rush hour on a 10-lane interstate, who of you has not been amazed at the thrumming whine of hundreds of rapidly turning tires and the little gasps they make as they hit seams and cracks in the pavement? The wheel. Human evolution will have reached its pinnacle when the earth is finally paved over. And nature, confined to a few large estates and carefully managed reserves, which we will visit on Sundays, the reserves, not the estates, and ride about in them on monorails and hovercraft with our grandchildren, if we can tear them away from their own myriad wheeled conveyances. Unfortunately, I will not be alive for this great event, the final paving over, which is estimated to take place at 6:39 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, August 21st, 2076, and therefore I will be unable to join in the massive global celebration to be organized around it, unless the new freeze-dried cloning techniques respond well to a recent infusion of capital. In any case, to all of those who will be there, I convey my best wishes for a wonderful event. If I'm able to be there in body, I will certainly be there in spirit. So I can leave him now for another year or two. This is a work of satire. I doubt there are real people out there who hold these beliefs, though I believe most of us act and live as if we do. I don't say this claiming any kind of personal exemption. Rosemary and I will have spent 70 gallons of gasoline getting here and back to New Mexico. But this brings me back to where I began. We're living in a time of unprecedented climate change, amid one of the great extinctions. And this is bound to translate into radical economic, political, and social change. If disorderly and chaotic, then all bets are off, all projections irrelevant. It will not be a World War II of good people and villains, or even of civil war fought over slavery. We have seen the enemy, and it is us. If orderly and planned, this war, or whatever it is, will likely, it is likely that much of what we now consider habitual, ordinary, and customary will become taxed, penalized, sanctioned, and finally illegal. Politically, economically, socially, religiously even, the future war against carbon will probably resembling something like the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the current state of the U.S. Congress. Contemporary society, to state the obvious, is a carbon economy. What do you do when finally carbon emissions are perceived by society as a whole to be the source of our many ills? In the face of this, I would like to echo Bill McKibben's recommendations here, which are: find your community, help build and strengthen your community, help rebuild the local economies that have been eviscerated by cheap fossil fuel and the transnational corporations who benefit from it. Work, in short, to pose alternatives to the centralized giant conglomerates of the age. And be prepared to free yourself from the complex dependencies, industrial and commercial, that we all have been enmeshed in. At various times and places throughout history, it has been illegal to plant a seed, certain kinds of seeds. Perhaps in the future it will become against the law not to take some small responsibility for feeding yourself, because collectively we will no longer be able to truck lettuce across the country, fly strawberries and peaches halfway across the globe. We will no longer be able to afford to turn whole herds of cattle and flocks of chicken into shrink-wrapped portions of meat. Perhaps it will become against the law not to have rooftop solar, hot water, not to recycle, illegal to manufacture single-use throwaway goods of any kind. I hope so. I myself look forward to these new types of crime. Thank you.
If anybody has any, if anybody has any questions for Stan, I can come around. I thought Rosemary was going to ask one over there.
I've stunned them into silence. But you know, half of the audience has heard me talk for hours and hours and hours, so of course there are no questions.
What was your inspiration for writing The Petroleum Man? Because I haven't heard anything from that before, and it was really interesting.
Well, as I said, I was trying to write a nonfiction piece about cars and industrial processes and all that, and that project kept expanding. It was very exciting, and then it just became overwhelming. And I can't remember what particular event of the Bush administration got me going, but there it was. Leon Tuggs is related to one of my other narrators, the narrator of Some Instructions, who's also a control freak, probably worse than Tuggs in many ways. probably most, I mean, he's related to Gascoigne also, but the tone of the book is more like Some Instructions. So that tone came rather easily. It was just imposed on another framework.
Do you prefer to write fiction or nonfiction?
Well, they may come out of different sides of the brain. When I'm writing nonfiction, I can go 2-3 days, and then I need to take a little break. If I'm writing fiction, it's 7 days a week. But when I stop writing fiction, it's because I think it's frivolous, I guess, and I think I need to get my teeth into something real. And then when I get my teeth into something real, it's a little too hard to chew. So I think, gee, let's go back to fiction. I'm freer there. I can create characters who can say anything, think anything. With nonfiction, you kind of have to be careful. You know, you're as I explained to one of Ty's group, you assume a role as a character in nonfiction. You assume a persona, but it's very close to your own. In fact, you don't assume. You don't think it's someone different. But in fiction, you can play. You can play in fiction, and that's probably, if I'm in a playful mood, I want to go there. Play with ideas, play with character, play with all kinds of language above all.
I have sort of a related question to the last two. So you talked a little bit about how Petroleum Man ended up being fiction. Could you talk a little bit now about how it ended up being funny? I mean, I've read the book that you talked about, Bill McKibben's Earth with 2 A's, and frankly, you know, you're talking about a lot of the same things, but after I read McKibben, I wanted to go to bed for 2 weeks.
Sure,
It's one of the most depressing books I've ever read. Yeah, I just wondered if you could talk about sort of the role of comedy and why you thought that might be an interesting kind of strategy for talking about this sort of stuff.
Well, again, I thought of this only kind of late before one of Ty's classes. One of my favorite writers when I was in graduate school was Molière, and I wrote a paper about Molière, and I kind of got to know him, know his work in France when I was a student. Actually, the best thing I saw was on French television, Georges Dindon. But what Molière does is he'll take some slightly off premise and really make it absurd. And so people get caught in their own logic. And what I mentioned today was in The Bourgeois Gentilhomme, Monsieur Jourdain, the bourgeois protagonist of the play, is astounded when his tutor informs him that he's been speaking prose all of his life. Oh, he's absolutely enchanted to know that he's been speaking prose. You know, this is a real illumination. Well, and there's some wonderful arguments in some of the farces, the imaginary malade imaginaire, the imaginary invalid, or what, I'm not sure how it translates. And he's treating, you know, kind of serious stuff, sickness and hypochondria. In fact, Molière died during the performance of the Malade Imaginaire. But it's this wonderful way of manipulating language, holding to logic, ostensibly or superficially holding to logic and reaching absolutely absurd positions. And one of my favorite passages in Petroleum Man is, I can't remember where it starts, but he advises probably Fabian and his granddaughter Rowena to that what capitalism now is really about is not dollars, but it's about the 1/10 of a cent. It's about 100th of a cent. That's where you really make money, is when you get into the area of 100th of a cent. Well, when you click on something on your computer, that's that 100th of a percent. So, I mean, to me, it was crazy logic when I wrote it, but now, of course, this is it's the way it is. So his justification is the poor shouldn't feel so poor because if they divide their dollars and cents into hundredths of cents, they're actually very wealthy. That's the crazy logic. So, I pretty much abandoned it, but I look back on it with a certain nostalgia. I should say, this is a terrible confession to make, that the pretext for that book, but it was a good pretext. You know, as an artist, you can do anything. I bought a very expensive luxury car that I'd coveted all my life and had it for 3 or 4 years. It was a very interesting experience. So I think sitting behind the wheel of a 1982 Rolls-Royce Silver Spur gave me Leon tugs. So I have that. Unfortunately, the advance didn't nearly cover the cost of the car. So I'll probably never live that down. But you know, nobody's perfect.
So when I was reading Gascoigne, it was very hard for me to place the novel in time because I was assuming the whole time that he was on his cell phone.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble.
I'm okay. When I read Gascoigne, it was difficult for me to know like when it was written and when it was set because I was assuming the whole time that he was on his cell phone in the car.
Right.
And you just talked about the hundredths of a cent thing, like something that seemed ridiculous to you when you wrote it, but now it's not ridiculous anymore. So how do you like accidentally prophesy that kind of stuff?
Well, that was easy. My family doctor in San Diego, or the family doctor in San Diego, who delivered me, I think, he had 2 Cadillacs, and he had radio television. This is in the late 40s. He had radio telephones in both of them. And they were rare, but not, you know, you'd see these big whip antennas on the rear bumper, and you knew that was a radio telephone. I assume the police had them. I have no idea how reliable they were. My father was a radio ham, and he had a transmitter in our 39 Ford with a generator in the back, and it was always terrifying when he decided to try to talk to a fellow radio ham while he was driving. He only had one eye to begin with, and he was talking he was talking on the radio, and my sister and I were sitting in the back seat trembling for our lives. The reception was terrible. So anyway, they did work, and I, of course, didn't even worry about the problem of whether reception went in or out or whatever. So, but you know, it was something there that I just picked up on and embroidered on. It was not prophetic.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. Stan's going to go out in the entryway, and he'll be there to answer some more questions and also sign books that folks have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.